Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall situation with water recycling, reuse in California. I'll talk about our public health goals for regulating water reuse, a little bit about what drives us towards more recycling in California, the need for it, and then some of the process we go through in developing public health protective reuse regulations. For agricultural irrigation reuse in California, which includes food crops eaten raw in much of the state, 37% of our total water reuse in California goes for agricultural irrigation. A total of about 300 cubic hectometers per year. We irrigate 25,000 hectares, total of about 52 crops. Not all of them food crops, but many of them are food crops. Indirect potable reuse, which is using reclaimed water to make or augment a source of drinking water, but not drinking water itself, is an important component in California, and that was the subject of the previous presentation. We developed regulations for indirect potable reuse via groundwater recharge in 2014, but prior to that, we were very active in the area. 7 large projects are in operation in California right now, including the Orange County Water District project. These were all approved, developed and approved pre-regulation, using draft regulations and a case-by-case evaluation and approval. Indirect potable reuse via groundwater recharge amounts to 19% of all California reuse water volume, 160 cubic hectometers per year, and it's done through surface spreading in the picture there, similar to what you saw in the previous presentation, and through injection. The 7 projects we currently have active in California are identified on this map. It's the Los Angeles greater metropolitan area, Orange County being at the southern end of this area. They're all in the Los Angeles area because that's where much of the need is. Los Angeles Basin has historically used and overused their groundwater. Its groundwater basins cover much of the area, and so it's been an important component of the water supply there. And due to overuse, both agricultural irrigation and urban use, it was necessary to start supplementing that groundwater. Currently, primarily driven by recent legislation in California, legislation passed as a consequence of our current drought, we've been charged with adopting surface water augmentation indirect potable reuse regulations. So that's in process, and that's a form of indirect potable reuse. Rather than recharging a groundwater basin, we're going to put that reclaimed water into reservoirs that are directly used as drinking water supplies. That currently does not and cannot happen in California. We've also been charged with, in the legislation, determining the feasibility of developing direct potable reuse regulations. So using recycled water to produce a finished drinking water supply. The people of California, through their vote, passed propositions. Proposition 1 was adopted during the drought to provide $625 million US dollars in funding for recycled water projects. These would be loans and grants for planning and construction activities, and this has had the desired effect. It's generated a lot of interest in further reclamation project development in California. We are also currently in process of authorizing 2 surface water augmentation indirect potable reuse projects, one very large. These projects have been under study for a long period of time in the San Diego area, and we're writing the permits, developing the permits to authorize those projects now in advance of finishing the regulations. And we have started the process of developing regulations or criteria, and I use those terms interchangeably, I'm afraid, for direct potable reuse in California. So what drives us towards more reuse in California? What's motivating us? Well, we're a very arid state, as Mehul suggested. The southern two-thirds of the state is Mediterranean climate. It doesn't get enough rainfall to sustain the use in those areas. We have to import water. And with climate change, we know we're going to get less snow in our Sierra Nevada mountains. And the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains has been our primary reservoir for supplying the state during the summer months. So as more of that precipitation falls as rain instead of snow, we have no way to store that. We're going to be in trouble. We have multi-year droughts. We're probably entering the 6th year of a severe drought right now. In the map indicates the darker areas of the more severe droughts. The whole central portion of the state a year ago was in very severe drought. We have population growth, very active in California, 38 million people now, on our way to 50 million. We've overused our groundwater historically. We've been blessed with extensive groundwater aquifers, but we've been exhausting those. We've been mining those. So 8,000 wells during this last drought had the water fall to levels where those wells were put out of service. Mostly small wells, but it's a critical problem in California. And land level has been dropping as we've overpumped these groundwater basins. California policy and legislation recently is pushing us very actively towards more reuse, and that policy and legislation has been driven largely by the water utilities in California that are concerned about their future supplies, and by environmental groups concerned about the use of the water competing with environmental needs. And we have tremendous competition among the various users: agriculture, urban areas, and the environmental needs. The process of getting to effective large-scale agricultural reuse in California started with regulation was adopted early in 1978, and that set basically a best available treatment requirement. Primary and secondary wastewater treatment for food crops eaten raw, followed by filtration and disinfection to a very low total coliform level. So not really a risk-based standard, but a best available treatment standard. A study was done in Monterey County that really drove agricultural reuse in the state. In the Monterey County area, we had irrigation pumping that was pulling seawater into a very important aquifer for the region. So the state actually imposed a plan on the area which would consolidate all the wastewater treatment from the metropolitan areas, the urban and communities, into a reclamation plant for agricultural irrigation reuse. If it could be demonstrated that for long-term irrigation, that reuse would be safe for the public, the crops themselves, the groundwater, the soil, and the farm workers. And that study, a very extensive study, did demonstrate that it would be safe in those regards. And that study developed the confidence of the agricultural community, the farmers. Based on that study, they had confidence that they could market their crops, so they were willing to use it. That area is now the largest raw eaten food crop area in the world, irrigated with recycled water, and they grow crops such as strawberries, lettuce, broccoli, celery, other crops eaten and eaten raw in cases. We reviewed the regulation. We formed a panel, a scientific panel, to evaluate the regulation to make sure it was meeting our new public health goal for all kinds of water recycling. That goal is that we would expose the public to no more than a 1 in 10,000 annual risk of infection from microorganisms. And that's comparable in effect to the 10 to the minus 6 DALI that has been used in much of the rest of the world. And that review did indicate that even though it was developed as a treatment-based standard, it does achieve that risk goal, our regulation. So no additional changes were made to the regulation. Now let me get into potable reuse and just briefly describe the various types of potable reuse that we address in California. Excuse me. The use of a river with a wastewater discharge upstream as a source of drinking water, we call incidental, de facto, or unplanned potable reuse. We have a number of those situations in California, but in California, due to a variety of circumstances and some good fortune, the wastewater contributions to those rivers is low. For each of them, the annual average contribution is less than 5%. Other parts of the United States have much higher wastewater contributions to their water supply. So that sort of forms our view of what indirect potable reuse is. That's a situation that we don't regulate as water recycling. It's handled adequately with our drinking water regulations. Getting into recycling, though, for potable reuse, drinking water reuse, the next step is what we call indirect potable reuse, which is what Mehul described they're doing in Orange County. And that's the planned delivery of recycled water to a groundwater or a surface drinking water source in significant fractions. It's characterized by substantial environmental separation between the wastewater treatment and the water reuse. And this separation is important not only for the confidence it gives the public, as was described in the previous talk, but it's important because it's a barrier to contaminants. It's an effective barrier to contaminants. And it provides time to identify and react to any failures that may have occurred in the treatment scheme. The next step that we're proceeding into in California is direct potable reuse, where you dispense with the environmental barrier and you're actually producing finished drinking water. Now, this is sort of the universe of drinking water sources, qualities we face in California. On the y-axis, I have chemical contamination. On the x-axis, pathogen, microorganism contamination. And we're fortunate to have a number of unimpaired sources down in the lower left-hand corner, rather pristine sources, but those tend to be small in rural areas. Most of our sources in California are impaired to some extent. They do need treatment to yield a safe drinking water. When you start getting further up and to the right, we have what we call our extremely impaired sources. We have a number of groundwater sources in California that are extremely impaired with industrial solvents, and they are being treated adequately to serve as drinking water supplies. And I've identified in the oval where we think potable reuse falls. Not terribly contaminated with chemicals, but pathogenic microorganisms are sort of off the scale. So that's the real acute threat that we have to deal with and that are most concerned about with our regulations. The public health goals for all reuse, I mentioned the 1 in 10,000 annual risk of infection, whether it's potable or non-potable reuse. But when we get into potable reuse, to achieve that goal, we've set log reduction requirements for certain classes of microorganisms. A 12 log reduction is required for virus and 10 log each for Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And these log reductions apply anywhere from the raw wastewater to the finished drinking water. so that any credible, well-documented barrier that achieves a certain log reduction value can be credited towards these totals we require. And there was sort of outrage in California when we first published these. A lot of people thought they were excessive, and now they're starting to wonder, well, maybe in certain circumstances they're not enough. So we sort of come full circle, but we've had a number of science panels evaluate them, and they believe they're appropriate to meet our 1 in 10,000 goal. For chemicals with potable reuse, we have to meet all our drinking water standards, of course, some 83 standards for specific chemicals. Plus, in California, we develop notification levels where we don't have enough science to develop a drinking water standard. We have our toxicologists identify a level at which we don't think there'll be any health risk, and we expect these projects to comply with that level, usually much lower than what the drinking water standard would probably be if it were adopted. And then for the unregulated chemicals, all the chemicals of emerging concern, pharmaceutical compounds, personal care products, our goal is to keep those at levels at or below what we see in our good river sources in California. So not zero by any means, but just down to a level that's historically been felt to be safe. This is just a typical planned indirect potable reuse project, and to start with the urban water use in the upper left-hand corner. That's where we convert perfectly good drinking water into wastewater or sewage. And then that's treated through rather conventional wastewater treatment schemes. And then for most of our indirect potable reuse projects, it's put through advanced wastewater treatment. The default, the basic treatment in California, although alternatives are considered, would be reverse osmosis followed by UV as part of an advanced oxidation process. And then it goes to the natural barrier. Either extensive travel through a groundwater aquifer or residence in a very significant reservoir surface reservoir, where it gets lots of mixing. And from there to water treatment, not because it's a reclamation project, but because that's what's ever necessary for that particular source that was augmented. And then you complete the cycle, start degrading the quality again in the next step. That's an oops, here we go. We have a lot of experience in California with indirect potable reuse groundwater recharge. The Montebello Forebay project Hill talked about. That gave us a lot of information about the effectiveness. The Montebello Forebay is a spreading project separate from Orange County, and where they spread the water, conventional treatment, they spread the water. The soil aquifer treatment you get through spreading it is very sustainable, very effective at removing organic compounds, about a 90% reduction of the anthropogenic organic compounds, and then significant dilution and travel time, extensive travel time in the aquifer before it gets to drinking water wells. The second project was the Water Factory 21 in Orange County, where they put it through either reverse osmosis or activated carbon, and then injected it as a seawater intrusion barrier. Even though the intent was to hold back seawater from infiltrating into the basin, the reclaimed water goes where the gravity takes it, so much of it was coming inland to drinking water wells. These two projects were studied extensively by the utilities to show that they were safe. And these projects demonstrated the need, the ability, and the community determination in California to do groundwater recharge. So that made it clear that we had to develop a comprehensive regulation process. During the 1980s and 90s, the scientific basis for regulation, a draft regulation, was developed. The state convened a science advisory panel. that evaluated the existing projects and determined what about them made them safe and could be used to approve additional safe projects. And their approval, their recommendations were based on limiting the exposure at the time. In other words, not going to 100% reclaimed water in a drinking water well, but keeping the level below that, requiring some dilution, and travel time, significant travel time, and low organic carbon levels in the treated wastewater. So that was the basis for our draft criteria. And we continued with extensive studies done by the utilities at these two projects that led to changes over time in the draft regulations. We gained experience using these draft regulations with a number of new proposals that came to us, large proposals for several seawater intrusion barriers along the Los Angeles County coast, which I showed on that map. And then the groundwater replenishment system that Mehul talked about. With every project, we had questions, so extra studies were done, and every project advanced the science and understanding of potable reuse significantly. Now, this case-by-case process we used, we had a draft regulation, but each project was different, so it involved a case-by-case approval. For most of them, we use an independent advisory panel as part of the process. It's a panel that's paid for by the project proponent, the utility, but the membership is approved by the state of California. And it's composed of science and technology experts that can address the technical questions specific to that project, questions that we may not feel we have all the answers to yet. And they panel acts as advisors to the project proponent, to their consultants, and to the state regulators. An independent advisory panel is required whenever the state regulators have technical questions about the proposal. There are numerous meetings over an extended number of years on all these projects where we discuss issues about the permit, what the permit requirements might be, and studies that are requested either by the independent advisory panel or by the state regulators. The independent panels do ask the utility to do studies so that they have all the information they need to make their recommendations. So each proposal had new conditions, new physical situations, new approaches they wanted to use, and there certainly were things in the criteria that inhibited them from doing the project they wanted to do and they wanted change. Well, it was fine. The project proponent was responsible for providing the research justifying any changes to our draft criteria. And the criteria changed as a consequence of that and improved. They became more flexible. They allowed additional treatment options. Additional monitoring schemes were demonstrated to be appropriate and approved. We changed a lot of unworkable criteria during this process, and we deleted unnecessary criteria where the science showed that some requirement wasn't serving the intended purpose or wasn't serving any purpose. We dropped it. We had a crisis at one point. Groundwater basin became contaminated with NDMA and 1,4-dioxane. So that was a crisis both for the utility, Orange County Water District, and ourselves, because we had failed to do our job in regulating the project. So the project operator was very responsive, not only in keeping the public informed what had happened and what they were doing to solve the problem, but in being very responsive as far as adding the treatment that was necessary to solve the problem and working with their downgradient well operators to keep them informed. So this response by Orange County Water District, I feel, was really responsible for saving potable reuse in California. Without that effective response, we would not have had the ability, we would not have had the authority and the confidence to continue to approve projects. We considerably tightened up our requirements, our draft criteria, as a consequence of that failure. Reduced the TOC, the allowable total organic carbon level. That required use of better thin film composite reverse osmosis membranes, and we also added as a routine the advanced oxidation process as a second barrier to organic contaminants. I'd mentioned earlier that the Science Advisory Panel recommended that we limit exposure to less than 100% reclaimed water at wells. This is a real problem in California because obtaining the dilution water impossible in some circumstances, especially during periods of drought. So one of our projects, West Basin Seawater Intrusion Barrier, requested that they be allowed to go to 100%. So our response, of course, was form an independent advisory panel, and we packed that panel with all kinds of experts we had confidence in. They came back to us after years of study by West Basin, research directed by that panel, with a recommendation that we could go to 100%. And so based on that recommendation and by requiring the additional treatment, they recommended all our indirect potable reuse projects and eventually our direct potable reuse projects are allowed to contribute 100% of their drinking water supply at a source. So that shows the success of that independent advisory panel process. We didn't have the capability on our own of getting that work done, getting that research done. Briefly, the regulation adoption process in California. When we have something we want to authorize, such as agricultural irrigation, potable reuse, first a complete review of the literature, but there's always gaps or questions we have after that. So we consult with experts on the science and technology, convene panels, or just call in experts with workshops, hold workshops and invite people to advise us on these issues. We consult with the water utilities for their experience and their insights. We draft criteria and request comments, and this may happen cycle after cycle over a long period of time as we refine the criteria, but we always send them out and get comment from the industry. Then we draft and submit a formal regulation package. It goes through extensive legal review, very painful legal review and other reviews. Get public comment, a formal process. We have to respond to those comments completely, thoroughly. Our attorneys make sure that we've addressed every comment, looking at the intent of the comment and making sure they're satisfied. And then we may or may not get final approval for the regulation. It may have to go back to some earlier step to continue the process. We adopted the groundwater replenishment regulation in 2014 for pathogens. We used that risk-based rational approach that we frankly borrowed from the Australian indirect potable reuse guidelines, using the 12 log, 10 log, and 10 log for the various organisms. It's based on very protective assumptions, using the highest level wastewater densities for organisms we found anywhere in the world, and then requiring all utilities to meet that. And we require robust multi-barrier treatment to meet those log reductions. For chemicals, I just mentioned drinking water standards, notification levels, CECs down to levels found in good conventional supplies, We specify source control, in other words, a very serious effort to try and keep the most toxic materials out of the wastewater stream. We require multi-barrier treatment for these organic contaminants. And then we want time underground, minimum of 2 months, but it depends on the project, minimum of 2 months time to identify any deficiencies in our monitoring or treatment scheme. And then that also allows some time to respond effectively. For surface water augmentation, as I said, we've been directed to adopt regulations. There we use a reservoir instead of a groundwater basin as the environmental buffer. Because you can get short circuiting in a reservoir, it's the time is not the critical factor. What's critical, the critical benefit in the reservoir is the mixing that occurs. So our criteria require a certain amount of mixing. If there is a short-term treatment failure, say up to 24-hour treatment failure, that you don't identify through your monitoring scheme, that water is going to be blended 10 to 1 or 100 to 1, depending on the situation, to attenuate the consequences of that treatment failure. So we built on our groundwater recharge regulations. San Diego has been proposing a project for decades. We put them through the mill to do research and studies to show that this could be safe. Their work has provided the basis for our regulation. And the draft, when I left California, we felt we'd completed the draft. But every few days, an attorney will have a question, or one of the policymakers will have a question, and we have to go back and change something. So the draft should be ready for public exposure very quickly. So as a consequence of this regulatory activity and the interest within the industry, rather than those 7 projects I showed you on the earlier map, these are all the existing or proposed projects to date. We're having active process of evaluating each one of these proposals. Many of them, most of them perhaps, will end up being approved projects. So indirect potable reuse and through groundwater recharge or surface water augmentation is being enthusiastically pursued in California. As far as direct potable reuse, legislation required that we set up an expert panel to study the feasibility of developing criteria. We've gone through that process. The panel did decide that it's feasible to develop criteria. We explained to them what our needs were for criteria, and they've completed their report, and that's available. You can do a search, California Recycling State Water Resources Control Board. It's several hundred pages long, a very thorough evaluation of the science behind direct potable reuse. We're now moving towards criteria. The expert panel and a separate advisory group, which we had, the Water Reuse, Direct Potable Reuse Research Initiative. Industry put up millions of dollars to do the studies, the scientific studies that would give us the confidence to write regulations, the scientific basis for regulations. So that's helped in this. And also all our experience with indirect potable reuse. But our experience with developing indirect potable reuse criteria indicates that it's a very sizable step from being confident that something can be done safely to producing criteria that assure that it will be done safely in every case all the time. We explained to them our needs when developing criteria so that they could determine whether developing criteria was feasible. Criteria must be enforceable. We need a very, very clear line between compliance and non-compliance if we're going to be able to enforce a regulation. It can't just be a bunch of good ideas. They must be unambiguous, and it's hard to get the ambiguity out of a regulation. And they must assure that any proposal that can comply with the regulation will actually produce safe water. In other words, there can't be any way to meet the letter of the regulation without also meeting the intent of the regulation. But a number of knowledge gaps remain, and I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but for instance, they say we need extra log reduction capacity. You know, we specified 12, 10, and 10 log reduction for various organisms. They said we should have some redundant treatment, some extra capacity, but they don't say how much. So if we're going to write a regulation, we have to know how much. We need a number. And for chemicals, they're worried about, the expert panel is worried about short duration discharges into the wastewater system of chemicals that may affect, over a short period of time, fetal development, for instance. And they're suggesting some form of treatment to provide some averaging or attenuation of peaks that may occur in the reclaimed water. But they don't define that. So we have to, in the regulation, we have to find a way of specifying that. We need a number. We don't even know the units of that number yet. So additional work is going to be used to finalize those regulations. And finally, we draft criteria and then invite the water industry to challenge them with all imaginable proposals to make sure they will always assure a safe, direct potable reuse project. And all these reports I've been referring to, if you just do a search for California State Water Resources Control Board water recycling, you get to them all very quickly. Thank you very much.